The deck of the Aethelgard did not feel like metal. It felt like the frozen, unyielding skin of a dead leviathan, designed to sap the hope from a man's bones long before it took his life. When the security wardens threw Vance Kestrel into the darkness of Sector 9, he did not cry out. He had long ago learned that in the deep reaches of the Chronos Rift, silence was the only currency that kept its value. Vance hit the floor hard, his shoulders screaming as it absorbed the impact. The sound of his own heavy breathing was immediately swallowed by the rhythmic, mechanical thud of the magnetic locks engaging. 1, 2, 3. The sequence was final, a heavy, pneumatic finality that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He lay there for a long moment, the taste of recycled oxygen and copper filling his mouth. His fingers brushed the surface of the floor, feeling the microscopic grit that lined the containment cell. It was abrasive, meant to discourage any attempt at sliding or quick movement. He forced himself to sit up, his muscles protesting the abuse of the last 48 hours of interrogation. He went through the mental checklist of a salvage engineer. Assess the environment, identify the hazards, find the exit. But there was no exit here. The darkness was thick, a physical weight that pressed against his retinas, smelling of industrial disinfectant, stale sweat, and something else. Something musky, wild, and heavy with adrenaline. Vance froze. He wasn't alone. From the far corner, a sound emerged that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to come from the floor itself. A sound that was too deep to be a purr and too rhythmic to be a simple growl. It was a warning, a territorial vibration that cut through the hum of the ship's internal systems. "I know you are there," Vance whispered, his voice sounding like dry parchment rubbing together. The response was a sharp, jagged hiss, followed by the unmistakable scrape of claws against a riveted bulkhead. Above them, the overhead lighting strip flickered, a dying halogen bar buzzing like a trapped hornet before strobing into a sickly, jaundiced yellow life. The sudden illumination carved the room into sharp planes of light and shadow, revealing the nightmare waiting in high definition. They were huddled against the far wall, two silhouettes of fur and tension. Vance recognized the species immediately, Velnari. In the outer rim, they were known as the Ghost Walkers of the Nebulae, feline humanoids capable of moving with a fluid grace that made human movement look like a series of clumsy accidents. But these were not the elegant traders or diplomats of the historical archives. These were the feral ones, the strays gathered from the wreckage of the Velnari homeworld, broken by the High Warden's cruelty. The larger one, a female with fur the color of obsidian, was a coil of pure predatory energy. She was crouched on her haunches, muscles bunching beneath her dark coat like steel cables ready to snap. Her ears were flattened against her skull, and her lips were pulled back to reveal teeth that were never meant for conversation. This was Nyxara, but it was the dark, wet patch on her left flank that caught Vance's eye. Her breathing was ragged, hitching with every inhalation, a telltale sign of a punctured lung or deep internal trauma. Hidden partially behind Nyxara's powerful frame was a smaller, younger Velnari. Her fur was a mottled pattern of gray and white, like storm clouds breaking over a winter sea. If Nyxara was a coiled spring, this one, Kiri, was a shattered mirror. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown out so large that the golden irises were mere slivers of light. She was shaking, a constant, violent tremor that made her claws rattle against the metal deck like falling rain. "Feral," the guard had sneered when he shoved Vance inside. "Try not to let them shred your throat before the show starts. The warden is looking for a bloodbath." Vance slowly raised his hands, palms open, keeping them away from his body. He made no sudden movements, using the same steady tone he used when approaching a volatile fuel reactor on the verge of meltdown. "I am not going to hurt you," Vance said, his voice level and devoid of aggression. Nyxara shifted, placing herself more firmly between Vance and the child. A low growl ripped from her throat, escalating in volume until it vibrated in Vance's own chest cavity. She looked ready to launch herself across the 3 meters of space separating them, her claws extending fully, glinting like obsidian needles in the flickering light. Vance didn't move. He sat back on his heels, regulating his breathing. 4 seconds in. Hold for 4. 4 seconds out. It was the rescuer's mantra, the only thing keeping the screaming terror in the back of his mind from taking the wheel. He looked at the younger girl, Kiri, and saw her ears twitch. She was watching his chest, her large eyes tracking the rhythmic movement of his flight suit. The Aethelgard suddenly groaned. It wasn't the sound of metal, but the agonizing moan of gravity generators struggling against a temporal surge. The floor beneath Vance ceased to be down. The world tilted violently on its axis as the ship was caught in the teeth of the Kronos rift. Vance was lifted from the deck as if a giant hand had swatted gravity aside. His stomach lurched into his throat and he flailed, his boots seeking purchase on a floor that was no longer there. Across the room, the two Velnari were thrown upward. Nyxara snarled, twisting in the air with feline agility, her claws sparking against the wall as she tried to find a grip. But Kiri was lighter. The gravity shift launched her like a projectile across the cell. "Watch out!" Vance shouted, though he wasn't sure who he was warning. He slammed shoulder first into the ceiling, which was now acting as a wall, and the air left his lungs in a pained wheeze. A split second later, a mass of fur and trembling muscle collided with him. It was Kiri. She hit him hard, her limbs scrambling for purchase. For a heartbeat, Vance expected the claws to shred his flight suit and the skin beneath. He braced for the searing pain of a predatory strike. But the pain did not come. Instead, her small hands that were remarkably human in shape despite the retractable claws, clamped onto the front of his jacket. She did not strike him. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, her entire body rigid with a terror so absolute it eclipsed her predatory instinct. The gravity stabilizers groaned again, fighting the turbulence of the storm outside, and slowly, agonizingly, the room righted itself. They dropped to the floor in a heap. Vance landed on his back, the wind knocked out of him for the second time in 5 minutes. Kiri remained sprawled on top of him, her storm cloud fur pressed against his chest. She was light, surprisingly so, her bone structure hollow and bird-like, despite her powerful appearance. She was not attacking. She was listening. Vance lay perfectly still, staring up at the jaundiced, flickering light. He could feel the rapid-fire hammer of Kiri's heart against his ribs. It was beating so fast he feared it might burst. But as he lay there, forcing his own breathing to remain slow, rhythmic, and steady, he felt a change. Kiri's ear, soft and tufted, twitched against his sternum. She was pressing her ear directly over his heart. Thump, 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 thump. It was the only steady rhythm in a world of chaos, to a creature whose entire world was currently a kaleidoscope of shifting time and failing gravity. The steady beat of a human heart was an anchor. "Get away from him!" A snarl cut through the air. Nyxara was on her feet, swaying slightly, her eyes burning with a mixture of fever and rage. She did not lunge, likely because the gravity shift had jarred her side wound, but her intent was clear. Kiri scrambled off Vance, retreating backward on all fours with a speed that blurred the eye. However, she did not return to the far corner. She stopped halfway, crouching, her gaze darting between Nyxara and the man on the floor. Vance sat up slowly, rubbing his bruised chest. He looked at Kiri. She was staring at him, or rather, at his sternum, with an expression of intense alien confusion. She brought a small furred hand to her own chest, tapping it once, then looked back at him. "Yeah," Vance breathed, wincing as he shifted his weight. "I am alive." A surprise. He turned his attention to Nyxara. Now that the adrenaline of the fall had faded, the medical reality of her condition was setting in. The dark patch on her side was spreading, the fur matted and sticky. The smell of infection, sweet, rotting, and sharp, was faint but distinct to a nose trained in battlefield triage. "You are septic," Vance said, pointing a finger toward her flank. "If you do not clean that, you will be dead in 48 hours. He did not use the soft voice of comfort now. He used the cold, hard voice of fact. Nyxara bared her teeth, a warning hiss escaping her, but she took a step back, her legs wobbling. Vance reached into the inner lining of his battered pilot's jacket. "Easy," he murmured, moving with exaggerated slowness. "Just easy." He withdrew a small vacuum-sealed pouch. It was his last resort kit, something every salvage mechanic in the rift kept hidden. It contained a collapsible flask of water, a single bioadhesive bandage, a small vial of broad-spectrum antiseptic, and a tube of nutrient paste that tasted like wet cardboard but contained enough calories to keep a man moving for a full day. He set the kit on the floor and slid it across the metal deck. The pouch spun and came to a rest exactly halfway between him and the Velnari. "Water," Vance said, tapping his own throat. "Medicine. Food. I am not asking for a trade. I am just tired of the smell of gangrene. It ruins the ambiance of this five-star resort." Nyxara looked at the items, then at Vance. Her eyes narrowed into amber slits. To her, this was a trap. In the Aethelgard, nothing was given. Everything was taken. But the way her tongue darted out to lick her dry nose betrayed her thirst. Vance leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms to show he was no longer a threat. He watched Kiri, who was staring at the nutrient tube with an intensity that was heartbreaking. She was starving, the hollows of her cheeks visible even under the fur. "Go on," Vance urged softly. "Eat." Kiri looked at Nyxara. The larger female remained rigid for a long moment, her chest heaving with the effort of standing. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Nyxara gave a microscopic nod. Kiri moved. She did not walk. She flowed. She was at the pile of supplies in a blink, grabbing the nutrient tube and the water. But then she paused. Her large, gold-ringed eyes turned back to Vance. She crept closer until she was within arm's reach. Vance held his breath, smelling the scent of dust, static electricity, and ancient fear. Kiri reached out a hand. Her claws were retracted, her fingers long and slender. She did not reach for his throat. Quick as a desert snake, she snatched the heavy leather work glove from Vance's left hand, which he had discarded during the fall. "Hey!" Vance started, instinctively pulling back, but she was already gone. Kiri darted back to the shadows, clutching the glove to her chest like it was a holy relic. She buried her nose in the leather, inhaling deeply. It smelled of engine grease, old sweat, and Vance. Vance sat there, one hand bare and cold, the other still gloved. He blinked, a jagged laugh bubbling up in his throat that he had to forcefully swallow. "Okay," he muttered to the empty air. "Team-building exercises like this are usually banned on my home station. But sure, keep the glove. It matches your eyes." The lights flickered again, followed by a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the very marrow of the ship. Vance looked to his right. The metal bulkhead was not smooth. Under the layers of grime and rust, there were etchings, complex fractal geometric patterns that looked less like engineering schematics and more like circuitry grown from seeds. As his heart rate settled, slowing down to a resting rhythm, he noticed something impossible. The lines in the metal were glowing faintly. A pulse of pale blue light throbbed in perfect synchronization with his own heartbeat. Thump, thump. The wall pulsed. Thump, thump. The light expanded. Vance placed his bare hand against the cold metal. The vibration was palpable, a deep, rhythmic purr that resonated through his palm and up his arm. "What is this place?" Vance whispered. Before he could investigate further, a sharp hiss of pneumatics cut through the silence. High up on the wall near the ceiling, a vent shutter snapped open. There was no rush of fresh air, no oxygen cycle. Instead, a thick, pinkish mist began to spray into the room, swirling in the jaundiced light like a poisonous sunset. The smell hit Vance instantly. It was sickeningly sweet, like overripe fruit left to rot in the sun, mixed with a sharp metallic tang that stung the back of his throat. Gas. Vance pulled the collar of his jacket up over his nose and mouth. "Cover your faces." But the Velnari did not cover their faces. The effect on them was immediate and terrifying. The pink mist did not just fill the room, it seemed to hunt. It coiled around the Velnari like a living thing, drawn to their heightened respiratory systems. Vance watched in horror as Nyxara, who had been slumped against the wall, suddenly arched her back. A guttural sound ripped from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress that quickly twisted into something far more dangerous. Her pupils dilated until her amber eyes were nothing but black pools of void. The muscles in her arms rippled as spasms of chemically induced adrenaline flooded her system. Vance realized with a sinking dread exactly what this was. He had heard stories of the High Warden's arena. This wasn't poison, it was a pheromone catalyst. The warden had mentioned a performance. This was the trigger. The gas was a synthesizer designed to strip away the higher brain functions of the Velnari, leaving only the raw, feral instinct to fight, to tear, and to kill. It was an aggression amplifier, and they were trapped in a 10 by 10 box with the result. Kiri dropped Vance's glove. She clawed at her own ears, shaking her head violently as if trying to dislodge a buzzing insect from her brain. She let out a high, piercing scream that sounded too much like a human child in pain. Nyxara was gone. The intelligent, wary warrior who had assessed the situation moments ago was replaced by a biological weapon. She turned toward Vance, but she didn't see a man who had offered her medicine. She saw a target. She saw an obstacle. She roared, a sound that shook the rivets in the floor, and launched herself across the room. Vance scrambled backward, but the cell was too small. Nyxara, stop. She was on him in an instant. Her weight was crushing, like being hit by a high-speed transit pod. Vance threw his arms up to protect his throat, feeling the claws scrabble against the thick, reinforced leather of his jacket sleeves. The force of the impact drove the breath from his lungs. He saw her face inches from his, her jaws open, saliva dripping from fangs that could puncture a steel plate. But inside the black void of her dilated pupils, Vance saw something else. For a split second, he saw a flicker of horror. Nyxara was trapped in her own body, a passenger in a vehicle that had been hijacked by the warden's chemicals. "Get off!" Vance grunted, bringing his knee up to create space. He managed to shove her to the side, rolling away and scrambling to his feet. He put the small metal bunk between them, his heart racing at 100 beats per minute. Nyxara shook her head, growling, preparing to leap again. But this time she didn't look at Vance. Her gaze snapped to the side, toward Kiri. The younger Velnari was writhing on the floor, the mist affecting her differently. She wasn't becoming aggressive. She was becoming terrified. Hallucinating, she clawed at the air, backing into the corner where the mist was thickest. Nyxara's feral instinct locked onto the movement. Prey, weakness, elimination. Nyxara crouched, her muscles coiling to spring at the child. No! Vance didn't think. He didn't calculate the survival probability or the odds of success. He moved. As Nyxara sprang, Vance threw himself into her path. He didn't try to fight her. That would be suicide. He acted as a shield. They collided in midair. Vance wrapped his arms around her torso, using his own momentum to tackle her away from Kiri. They hit the ground hard, rolling across the abrasive floor. Vance felt a sharp flare of pain in his forearm as a claw tore through the fabric and scored his skin, but he grit his teeth, refusing to let go. "Nyxara, listen to me," Vance shouted into her ear, struggling to hold the thrashing alien. "This isn't you. It's the gas. Fight it." She was too strong. She broke his grip with a heave of her shoulders that nearly dislocated his jaw. She spun around, pinning Vance to the floor, her hand, a paw of deadly intent, raised with claws fully extended, ready to swipe his throat out. Vance stared up at death. But in that final second, his engineer's mind spotted the opening. He saw the wound on her side. The movement had torn the bandage, and fresh blood was seeping out. He saw the bundle of nerves just under the armpit, exposed by her raised arm. It was a pressure point, a universal constant in feline-derived physiology where the brachial plexus met the cluster of lymph nodes. Vance's hand shot out. He didn't strike, he pressed. He drove his thumb into the nerve cluster, digging deep, finding the gap between the muscle groups and squeezing with every ounce of strength he had left. Nyxara's eyes went wide. The roar died in her throat, replaced by a sharp gasp of shock. Her arm went limp, the neural signal cut off like a severed wire. The paralysis was temporary, only lasting seconds, but it was enough. Her weight collapsed onto him, heavy and fever-hot. Vance lay there gasping for air, his hands still jamming the nerve cluster, his body shaking from the adrenaline dump. From the corner, a sound emerged. Vance turned his head, sweat stinging his eyes. Kiri was standing there. She was no longer covering her ears. She was staring at Vance, staring at the man who had thrown himself between a monster and a child. Her mouth opened, her vocal cords straining against a shape of words that were not designed for her throat. Lu, Dar. It was a growl. It was a whimper. But it was also a name. Lu, Dar. The single word hung in the sweet, poisonous air, more shocking than the violence, more profound than the silence. Vance realized she was trying to say his name, or perhaps she was describing the sound he made. The mist swirled around them, but for the first time since the door had slammed shut, the darkness felt a little less absolute. The silence that followed was heavier than the gravity plating beneath the deck. It was a tangible weight, broken only by the ragged, wet rasp of Nyxara's breathing and the high-pitched whine of the ventilation system trying to scrub the last of the pheromones from the air. Vance did not move immediately. He remained frozen in the aftermath, his hand still clamped over Nyxara's shoulder. He could feel the thrum of her biology beneath his fingertips, a pulse that was too fast, too erratic. It was like holding a live grenade with the pin pulled halfway out. Slowly, calculating the risk with every millimeter of movement, Vance eased the pressure. He waited for the snap of fangs or the slash of claws. He waited for the feral instinct to override the temporary paralysis. Nothing happened. Nyxara remained limp, a massive weight of muscle and fur draped across his legs. The chemical rage had burned itself out, leaving behind only the exhaustion of a body fighting a septic war against itself. Clear, Vance whispered to himself, the word forming a small cloud of condensation in the chilling air. He shifted, groaning as his own bruises made themselves known. His shoulder throbbed where he had hit the ceiling, and his forearm where Nyxara's claw had grazed him was beginning to sting with a sharp, insistent heat. He gently rolled her off him, laying her on the cold metal floor. She made a sound in her throat, a low, pitiable whimper that sounded nothing like the apex predator she was supposed to be. It sounded like something small and lost. Vance sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his uninjured hand. He looked toward the corner. Kiri was there, crouched on top of the ventilation housing, her limbs tucked tight against her body. Her eyes, those enormous pools of gold and black, were locked onto him. She was not growling. She was vibrating, a high-frequency tremor that blurred her outline in the dim light. "I am not going to hurt her," Vance said, his voice rough. He kept his hands visible, palms up. "And I am not going to hurt you. We are done with the wrestling match for today." Kiri tilted her head. The movement was bird-like, sharp and inquisitive. She did not relax, but she did not flee. Vance turned his attention back to Nyxara. The dark patch on her side was not just blood anymore. It was a slurry of plasma and infection. The smell was distinct, sweet, cloying, and dangerous. "You are burning up," he murmured, hovering his hand over her flank. The heat radiating from her was intense. "If I leave that shrapnel in there, you will not wake up." He looked around the cell. It was a barren box of misery. No medical bay, no sterile field, just his last resort kit. Water, a single bandage, antiseptic, and nutrient paste. "Okay," Vance breathed, forcing his mind into the cold, compartmentalized state of emergency triage. "Improvise." He reached for the magnetic locking mechanism on his boot. With a sharp tug, he detached a small, flat strip of titanium alloy used to reinforce the ankle support. It was not a scalpel. It was barely a shim. But one edge was jagged, where it had been worn down over years of spacewalks. He held the metal strip up to the flickering light. Crude, he judged, but it will cut. A low growl came from the vent. Vance froze. He looked up. Kiri had moved. She was now on the floor, halfway between him and Nyxara, her body lowered. Her gaze was fixed on the piece of metal in his hand. To her, it looked like a weapon. It looked like a knife he intended to plunge into her fallen companion. Vance understood the calculation she was making. He slowly lowered the metal strip. He needed to bridge the language barrier, and he needed to do it fast. "Watch," Vance said clearly. He rolled up his left sleeve, revealing the fresh, angry scratch Nyxara had given him. It was not deep, but it was bleeding. He took the vial of antiseptic from the floor. With deliberate, exaggerated movements, he uncorked it. He poured a few drops onto his own wound. The sting was immediate and vicious. Vance hissed through his teeth, his hand jerking involuntarily. "Mother of," he muttered, blinking away the reflex tears. "That stings." He looked at Kiri. She had flinched when he hissed, her ears swiveling forward. "See?" Vance gestured to his arm. "Medicine? Pain, then better?" not a weapon. He then picked up the metal shim. He scraped it lightly against the fabric of his trousers, cleaning it as best he could, then poured the rest of the antiseptic over the metal. The liquid hissed as it hit the cold alloy. "I am not making soup out of you, Nixara," Vance said, his tone conversational despite the tension. "I am just a mechanic who hates seeing broken things stay broken." Kiri did not retreat. She watched him with an intensity that felt almost telepathic. Then with a fluid motion, she shifted her position. She did not come to stop him. Instead, she moved to the far wall, positioning herself directly in front of the ventilation grate where the gas had come from. She sat there, her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room, her ears swiveling like radar dishes. She was standing guard. "Good girl," Vance whispered. He turned back to Nixara. "All right, Sleeping Beauty. This is going to hurt you more than it hurts me," which is a cliché, but in this case, accurate. The procedure was a nightmare of tactile sensations. Velnari skin was tougher than human skin, requiring more pressure than Vance wanted to apply. When the metal finally parted, swollen tissue and dark blood welled up immediately. Vance worked by feel as much as by the dying light, his fingers digging into the alien musculature to find the foreign object. Nixara whimpered in her unconscious state, her legs kicking out reflexively. Vance had to lean his weight across her hips to keep her steady. "Almost there," he gritted out, sweat dripping from his nose onto the floor. "Come on, come on!" His fingertips brushed against something hard and jagged, buried deep near the rib cage. He hooked the metal shim under it. With a wet suction sound, he leveraged the debris out. It clattered onto the metal floor, a twisted piece of black polymer, likely a fragment of armor driven in by an explosion. "Got you," Vance exhaled. He quickly flushed the wound with the remaining water and slapped the bioadhesive bandage over the incision. It was a temporary fix for a permanent problem, but it bought time. He sat back, his hands shaking, his chest heaving. He felt lightheaded, the exertion burning through his meager calorie reserves. He looked over at Kiri. She was still by the vent, but her head was turned toward him. She had watched the whole thing. She looked at the bloody piece of polymer on the floor, then at the bandage on Nixara's side, and finally at Vance's blood-stained hands. For a moment, the alien and the human simply existed in the shared silence, bound by the universal language of pain and relief. Vance leaned his head back against the cold wall, closing his eyes. He listened to the ship. Thump, 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 thump. The walls were still pulsing. The Aethelgard was watching. And as Vance drifted into a shallow, exhausted sleep, he felt a small, warm weight settle against his side. He didn't open his eyes, but he knew Kiri had moved. She wasn't holding the glove anymore. She was holding his hand. The transition from unconsciousness to reality for a Velnari was not a slow drift, but a violent snap of synapses. Nixara's eyes flew open, the pupils narrowing into needle-thin vertical slits before the amber irises could even register the dim, jaundiced light of the cell. Her first instinct was the kill, a primal, jagged impulse born of 1,000 years of predatory evolution. Her right hand swept across the floor, claws unsheathing with a metallic snick, seeking the soft throat of the intruder she remembered from the red-hued haze of the pheromone mist. But her body betrayed her. As she tried to lunge, a bolt of white-hot agony lanced through her left side, radiating from the spot where the shrapnel had been lodged. It felt as if someone had driven a heated copper spike into her ribs. She collapsed back onto the deck, a sharp, choked hiss escaping her bared fangs. "Easy," a voice said. It was low, steady, and carried the weight of someone used to talking down a malfunctioning reactor. "You move like that again, and you are going to rip the adhesive. And trust me, I do not have a spare." Nixara's head whipped toward the sound. The human. Vance. He was sitting 5 meters away, leaning against the far bulkhead with his arms crossed over his chest. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, his face a map of exhaustion and fresh bruises. Beside him, curled into a small, shivering ball of gray fur, was Kiri. The child was asleep, her head resting on a discarded flight jacket that smelled of ozone and human sweat. Nixara looked down at her flank. A smooth, translucent biobandage was stretched over her skin, the edges glowing with a faint, antiseptic blue light. The swelling had gone down, and the angry purple streaks of infection had receded, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache instead of the fire of septicemia. "What did you do?" Nyxara rasped. Her voice sounded like two stones grinding together at the bottom of a well. "I played mechanic," Vance replied. He didn't move, keeping a respectful distance. "You had a piece of polymer plating the size of my thumb buried near your sixth rib. It was starting to rot. I pulled it out, flushed the wound, and slapped a patch on it." Nyxara's ears swiveled backward, a gesture of deep suspicion. "You touched me, while I was under." Vance shrugged, though the movement clearly caused him pain. "I didn't have much of a choice. You were burning up, and the kid was terrified. If I had let you die, I would have been stuck in here with a corpse and a grieving cub. I am a salvage engineer, Nyxara. I do not like waste, especially not the waste of a life." Nyxara's hand hovered over the bandage. She could feel the steady, rhythmic pulse of the biorepair nanites working beneath the surface. For a Velnari to be touched by a stranger, especially an unbonded human, was a violation of the deepest cultural taboos. But as she looked at Kiri, who was breathing deeply and safely for the first time in days, the fury in her chest began to cool into a wary, jagged confusion. "Why?" she asked, her voice slightly stronger. "You owe us nothing. We are the feral ones. The Warden says we are beasts, void scum. The Warden is a hull thumper who probably couldn't tell the difference between a fuel line and a neural shunt," Vance said, his tone turning sharp and bitter. "I have seen beasts, Nyxara. I have seen men in silk suits who would vent an entire colony into the vacuum just to save 10 credits on oxygen taxes. And I have seen creatures the galaxy calls monsters share their last ration with a stranger." He leaned his head back against the cold metal, staring up at the flickering light strip. "I am not a hero. I am a guy who has spent 15 years pulling pieces of history out of the wreckage of the Kronos Rift. I have seen what happens when you let the math of survival become the only thing that matters. You end up alone in a very expensive cage." Nyxara sat up slowly, moving with the calculated caution of a wounded predator. The pain was still there, but it was manageable. She looked at Kiri, then back at Vance. Her gaze fell on his left arm, where a crude bandage, made from a strip of his own shirt, was wrapped around a series of deep gouges that matched the shape of her own claws. "I did that," she said. "It wasn't a question." Vance looked at the arm. "Yeah, you were under the influence of the Warden's cocktail. Don't sweat it. I have had worse scrapes from a stubborn atmospheric scrub." He reached out and tapped the metal wall behind him. The ship felt alive, a low-frequency hum vibrating through the plates. "Can you hear it?" "Hear what?" Nyxara asked. "The song," Vance whispered. "The Aethelgard isn't just a ship. It is a semi-biological seed vessel. It was built by the pre-rift engineers to navigate the temporal anomalies by harmonizing with the crew. The Warden thinks he can drive it with fear and chemicals, but he is just bruising the hull. He is forcing a scream out of a machine that wants to sing." Nyxara closed her eyes, tilting her head. She opened her senses, the tufted tips of her ears twitching as she filtered out the hiss of the air recyclers and the buzzing of the lights. Deep beneath the mechanical noise, she felt it, a rhythm. It was faint, buried under layers of static in the ship's own distress, but it was there. "It sounds like a heartbeat," she murmured. "Exactly," Vance said. 100 years ago, a full crew of 1,000 people would have been plugged into this ship. Their collective biorhythms would have created a resonance field that could slice through the Kronos Rift like a hot wire through ice. But the Warden is alone. He is trying to pilot a city-sized orchestra by hitting the keys with a hammer. He looked at Nyxara, his eyes intense and weary. "I think that is why he brought us here. He is looking for a new frequency. He is experimenting on you, Velnari, because your nervous systems are naturally tuned to high-frequency vibrations. He wants to find a way to hijack your pulse and use it as a battery for his navigation." "The coward," Nyxara spat. "He would turn us into components." Vance nodded. "He is a grifter who found a throne in the trash, but he made a mistake. He forgot that a bridge isn't made of one wire. It is made of a dozen strands woven together." He stood up, moving slowly to avoid startling her. He walked to the corner where the water dispenser was located. He pressed the button. and a thin stream of recycled water trickled out. He filled the flask from his kit and walked back, setting it on the floor halfway between them. "Drink," he said. "You need to stay hydrated if the repair nanites are going to do their job." Nyxara watched him. For the first time, she didn't see a prey animal or a threat. She saw a man who was as broken as the ship they were trapped in, yet was still trying to tighten the bolts. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool plastic of the flask. "Vance," she said, testing the weight of the name. "You said you have seen what happens when the math of survival is all that matters. What happened to your crew?" Vance went still. The air in the cell seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners stretching like long, dark fingers. He didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low it was almost lost to the hum of the walls. 7 years ago, I was the chief engineer on the Orion's Wake, a salvage hauler. We found a derelict research station drifting near the event horizon of a collapsing star. It was a treasure trove of pre-rift tech, billions of credits. He let out a long, shuddering breath. We were halfway through the extraction when the gravity anchor snapped. The station started to slide into the well. We had 30 minutes to get everyone out. My team, 5 of the best people I have ever known, were deep in the core, trying to decouple the main processor. Nyxara watched his hands. They were clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. "I stayed on the ship," Vance continued, his eyes unfocused, staring at a ghost only he could see. "I watched the telemetry. I did the math. If I waited another 10 minutes to let them reach the airlock, the ship would be caught in the gravity shear. We would all die. But if I cut the docking clamps right then, the ship would have enough thrust to escape." "And?" Nyxara whispered. "I cut the clamps," Vance said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made the words even more devastating. "I saved the ship. I saved the 30 people in the crew deck, but I left 5 of my friends behind. I watched them on the short-range comms as the station was crushed into a single point of light. I chose the ship over the people. I chose the math over the bond." He looked at Nyxara, his face a mask of grief. "I have spent the last 7 years trying to find a way to undo that calculation. I have been looking for a reason to prove that I am more than a man who can subtract lives to find a remainder." Nyxara didn't say anything. She couldn't. In the Velnari culture, to abandon a member of the pack was a fate worse than death. It was to be unsung, a soul drifting in the silence forever. But as she looked at Vance, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man who had been carrying a tomb inside his chest for 7 years. "Maybe that is why we are here," Nyxara said softly. "Not for the Warden's show, but for the song." Vance looked at her, a flicker of something that might have been hope appearing in his tired eyes. "Maybe. But the Warden is coming back soon. And next time, he won't just use gas. He is going to want results." He looked over at Kiri, who had stirred in her sleep, her small hand reaching out to find the edge of Vance's jacket. "We need to be ready," Vance said. "We need to find our own rhythm before he tries to give us one of his." Nyxara nodded, her claws retracting into her paws. She took a long drink of the water, the cool liquid revitalizing her. For the first time since she had been captured, she felt like a warrior again. Not a feral beast, not a prisoner, but a shield bearer. "Then teach me, Vance," she said. "Teach me how to hear the ship." 3 hours later, the temperature in the cell had dropped by 10 degrees Celsius. It was a common occurrence on the Aethelgard. The ship's life support was as temperamental as a dying star, constantly rerouting power from the habitation decks to the structural integrity fields. Vance sat in the center of the floor, his eyes closed, his palms pressed flat against the vibrating metal. Beside him, Nyxara did the same, though her movements were more fluid, more instinctive. Kiri sat between them, her small, tufted ears swiveling in a constant, rhythmic dance. She was the most sensitive of the 3, her young nervous system acting like a high-gain antenna for the ship's subconscious. "Do not listen with your ears," Vance instructed, his voice a low rumble that blended with the ship's hum. "Listen with your bones. The Aethelgard speaks in subsonics. Every time a relay fires, every time a fuel line pulses, it creates a wave. You have to find the frequency that repeats. The baseline." "I feel it," Nyxara whispered. "It is jagged, like a broken glass. That is the Warden's influence, Vance said. He is trying to force the ship into a hard burn toward the center of the Kronos Rift. He thinks there is a stable exit at the core of the anomaly, but he is wrong. He is just driving us into a gravity well that will strip the atoms from our bones. He moved his hand slightly, finding a seam in the plating where the bioluminescent light was brightest. Here, this is a primary data conduit. It is the nervous system of the Sector 9 block. Kiri leaned forward, her golden eyes wide. She placed her tiny hand over Vance's. The blue light in the wall suddenly flared, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. A low melodic hum echoed through the small room, a sound so pure it made the air feel electric. She can hear it perfectly, Nyxara said, her voice filled with wonder. Kiri is a resonator. On our world, she would have been a high seer. She is a kid who deserves to see a sky that isn't made of flickering halogens, Vance said. Suddenly, the lights in the cell didn't just flicker. They turned a harsh, clinical white. The hum of the walls was drowned out by the scream of a high-gain speaker hidden in the ceiling. "Attention, biological assets," a voice purred. It was smooth, cultured, and carried a synthetic warmth that felt like a razor blade wrapped in velvet. It was High Warden Silas. Vance stood up, pulling Kiri behind him. Nyxara was on her feet in a heartbeat, her claws out, her obsidian fur bristling with defiance. "I trust you have enjoyed your little bonding session," Silas continued. His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The biometric feeds from your cell are quite fascinating. The adrenaline spikes, the cortisol levels, and now this fascinating little harmonic resonance you are creating. It is almost poetic." "Eat dirt, Silas," Vance snarled, looking up at the speaker. "If you want a show, buy a ticket. Otherwise, turn the air back up. It's freezing in here." "Ah, Vance Kestrel," Silas chuckled. "The man who can fix anything but his own conscience. I have been reviewing your files. A chief engineer with a penchant for sacrifice. Tell me, do you plan on leaving these two behind as well when the walls start to buckle? Or have you finally found a pack worth dying for?" Vance's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. He could feel Nyxara's gaze on the back of his neck, but he didn't turn around. "The Aethelgard is hungry," Silas said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming cold and predatory. "The Kronos Rift is demanding a tribute. We are entering the first shear zone in 6 hours. If the ship's shields do not stabilize, the hull will be crushed into a singularity, and the only way to stabilize those shields is through a synchronized neural pulse." He paused, the silence in the cell ringing with a terrible weight. "You have 6 hours to achieve a total harmonic sync," Silas commanded. "One human, one warrior, one child. If you fail to reach a resonance of 95%, I will vent the oxygen from Sector 9 to preserve the power for the bridge. Survival is a matter of choice, Vance. Choose to be a component or choose to be Stardust." The speaker clicked off with a final, mocking hiss. The white light remained, blinding and cold, stripping away the comfort of the shadows. 6 hours, Nyxara said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "We cannot do it. A total sync takes years of training for a Velnari pack. To do it with a human in 6 hours is impossible. Impossible is just a word for people who have never had to fix a warp drive with a piece of wire and a prayer," Vance said. He turned to look at her. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like the salvage engineer who had survived 15 years in the graveyard of the stars. "Nyxara, look at me." She met his eyes. The amber was clouded with doubt, her predatory instincts screaming at her to run, to hide, to find a way out that didn't involve trusting a stranger. "Silas thinks we are components," Vance said. "He thinks he can force us together using the threat of death. But he doesn't understand the song. You can't force a harmony. You have to find it." He sat back down, reaching out his hands to both of them. "Kiri, I need you to find the beat. Nyxara, I need you to be the strength that holds it. And I will be the bridge." "What about the math, Vance?" Nyxara asked, her voice a whisper. "What if the math says we won't make it?" "Then we change the variables," Vance said. He took her hand. Her claws were retracted, but her grip was like iron. For the next 4 hours, the cell was a sanctuary of focused desperation. Vance pushed his mind into the machine, feeling the agonizing strain of the ship's structure. He could feel every stress fracture in the hull, every overheating capacitor in the shield generator. It was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with his bare hands. Nyxara was the anchor. She poured her physical and mental discipline into the connection, her Velnari physiology acting as a filter for the ship's chaotic feedback. She felt Vance's pain, his guilt, his exhaustion, and instead of recoiling, she wrapped her own strength around it. She was the shield bearer, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't just protecting a person. She was protecting a soul, and Kiri was the spark. She hummed a low, wordless melody that danced around the edges of the ship's subsonics. She found the gaps in the static and filled them with a vibration that was pure, innocent, and unwavering. Slowly, the numbers on the wall-mounted diagnostic screen began to climb. 40%, 55%, 70%. The ship responded. The jaundiced lights in the hallway outside their cell turned a soft, pulsing blue. The air grew warmer, smelling of rain and fresh soil, the scent of the Aethelgard's dormant hydroponics bay awakening. "We are doing it," Nyxara gasped. Her forehead was slick with sweat, her fur matted. "I can feel the ship. It's breathing with us. It's working because we are choosing it," Vance said. His voice was strained, blood beginning to trickle from his nose as the neural feedback intensified. "It's not about blood, Nyxara. It's about the choice to stay, to hold the line together." But as they reached 80%, the Aethelgard shivered. A massive gravity shear hit the ship, a hammer blow from the Chronos rift that sent a shockwave of temporal distortion through the decks. The connection shattered. Vance was thrown backward, his head slamming into the bulkhead. Nyxara cried out, her side wound reopening under the strain. Kiri was tossed into the corner, her screams silenced as she hit the floor and went limp. The lights turned blood red. The oxygen vents began to hiss with a terrifying hollow sound. "Alert," the synthesized voice of the ship announced. "Resonance lost. Sector 9 oxygen depletion in 5 minutes." Vance struggled to sit up, the world spinning in a nauseating kaleidoscope of red and black. He looked at Kiri. She wasn't moving. He looked at Nyxara, who was clutching her side, her face twisted in agony. He looked at the diagnostic screen. 0%. The warden's laughter echoed through the speaker, a dry, metallic sound. "A valiant effort, Vance. But in the end, the math always wins, doesn't it? 5 minutes of air left. I suggest you use it to say your goodbyes." Vance looked at his hands. They were shaking. The terror was there, the same cold, paralyzing fear he had felt 7 years ago on the Orion's wake. The instinct to survive, to find a way out, to leave the broken pieces behind and run for the escape pods. But then he felt a hand on his arm. Nyxara had crawled across the floor. She was bleeding, her obsidian fur stained crimson, but her eyes were clear. She wasn't looking at the exit. She was looking at him. "I am not a component, Vance," she rasped, "and you are not a man of math." She reached out and pulled the unconscious Kiri into her arms, then moved closer to Vance. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her purr beginning to rumble deep in her chest. Not a sound of comfort, but a war cry of resonance. "We are a pack," Nyxara said, "and a pack does not die in silence." Vance felt the heat of her body, the vibration of her purr, and the small, shallow breaths of the child. The fear didn't vanish, but it transformed. It became fuel. He reached out and grabbed the data conduit one more time. He didn't try to pilot the ship. He didn't try to do the math. He just sang. He hummed the same lullaby he had heard his mother sing on a colony world 30 years ago. It was a simple 3-note melody, but he poured every ounce of his grief, his hope, and his stubborn human defiance into it. The ship's walls didn't just pulse, they roared. The red light was obliterated by a blinding sapphire brilliance. The oxygen vents stopped hissing. The temperature stabilized at exactly 22 degrees Celsius. On the diagnostic screen, the numbers didn't climb. They vanished, replaced by a single word in the ancient script of the pre-rift engineers. Resonance. The cell door didn't just open. The magnetic locks vanished entirely, the heavy metal slab sliding into the wall with a sound of utter submission. Vance stood up, his body aching, his vision blurred, but his spirit unyielding. He picked up Kiri, cradling her against his chest. Nyxara stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, her claws glinting in the blue light. They didn't look like prisoners. They looked like the crew. "Let's go find the Warden," Vance said. "I think he is overdue for a performance review." Nyxara bared her teeth in a savage, beautiful grin. "I will handle the termination," she said. They stepped out of the cell and into the long, curved corridor of the Aethelgard. The ship was no longer screaming. It was humming a three-note melody. And for the first time in 7 years, Vance Kestrel felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The silence of the Sector 9 corridor was not the empty void of space, but a pressurized, expectant stillness. The blue bioluminescence of the walls pulsed with a slow, hypnotic cadence that matched Vance's indrawn breath. He carried Kiri against his chest, her small heart a rapid, fluttering rhythm against his sternum. Nyxara moved a half-step ahead of them, her obsidian fur seeming to drink in the sapphire light, her claws unsheathed and glinting like black glass. They didn't look like escaped prisoners anymore. They looked like parts of the ship itself. "Vance," Nyxara whispered, her ears swiveling toward a junction 50 meters ahead. "The air is changing. It smells of ozone and burnt copper. Something is coming." "That's the main power conduit for the gravity anchors," Vance said, his voice low and gritty. "If Silas is pushing the ship into a hard burn toward the rift's center, that's where the friction will be highest. We're heading straight into the gut of the machine." As they rounded the corner, the soft blue light was suddenly bisected by a wall of searing, white-hot energy. A massive chasm opened in the deck, a thermal pit where the ship's primary cooling lines had ruptured. Far below, the orange glow of the sublight drive reflected off clouds of superheated steam. A narrow walkway, constructed of translucent, semi-biological glass, stretched across the abyss. "The resonance bridge," Vance murmured, his eyes widening. "It looks like it's made of frozen water," Nyxara said, stepping toward the edge. She sniffed the air, her nose wrinkling at the stinging heat. "It's thin, too thin for all of us." "It's not thin," Vance corrected, stepping up beside her. "It's reactive. Look at the edges." The glass walkway was flickering, its opacity shifting in time with the ship's erratic hum. This was the Aethelgard security measure. In the old days, a bonded crew would cross this bridge by projecting their collective mental stability onto the glass. The ship would read their unified intent and solidify the structure. But now, with the Aethelgard in the throes of a temporal seizure, the bridge was a literal manifestation of their internal doubt. "Vance Kestrel," Silas's voice boomed from a hidden speaker, distorted by the magnetic interference of the thermal pit. "You've found my little test. Poetic, isn't it? A bridge that only exists if you believe in the person standing next to you. Tell me, Chief Engineer, do you trust the feral one to hold your weight? Or are you calculating the trajectory of your fall already?" "Shut it, Silas," Vance barked, though his palms were beginning to sweat. He looked at the bridge. It was translucent, almost invisible in places. To cross it, they would need to maintain the same level of resonance they had found in the cell, but under the pressure of a 1,000-foot drop into a plasma reactor. "Nyxara," Vance said, turning to her, "I need you to take Kiri." Nyxara's ears pinned back. "No, I am the shield bearer. I take point. You follow in my shadow." "Listen to me," Vance said, his voice sharp with urgency. "The bridge reacts to the strongest biological rhythm. Kiri is a resonator, but she's scared. Her pulse is too fast. If she goes with me, I might not be able to damp the noise. But your Velnari discipline? You can anchor her. You cross first. I'll follow and bridge the gap." Nyxara stared at him, her amber eyes searching his face for any sign of the man who had abandoned his crew 7 years ago. She saw the lines of exhaustion, the blood on his collar, but she also saw a stubborn, frantic kind of loyalty that didn't belong to a man of math. "If you drop, human," Nyxara growled, gently taking the sleeping child from his arms, "I will come down there and kill you myself before the plasma does." "Deal." Vance managed a small, jagged smile. Nyxara stepped onto the glass. Immediately the bridge groaned. The translucent surface clouded over, turning a deep, solid cerulean. The bioluminescence beneath her feet flared with every step she took. She moved with agonizing slowness, her tail twitching for balance, her eyes locked on the far side. Kiri whimpered in her sleep, her small hands clutching Nixara's fur, and for a second, the bridge flickered, turning dangerously clear. "Focus, Nixara," Vance shouted. "Think of the song. Think of the beat." Nixara closed her eyes, her deep, resonant purr beginning to vibrate through her chest. The bridge solidified. She reached the other side in 20 agonizing seconds, stepping onto the solid deck and turning back immediately, her hand outstretched. "Now, Vance." Oh. Vance took a breath. He looked down into the orange hell below. His old ghost chose that moment to whisper in his ear. "You're going to fail again. You're going to let them down. You're just a scavenger with a lucky streak." He stepped onto the bridge. The glass didn't turn blue. It turned a sickly, vibrating violet. The surface beneath his boots felt like jelly, swaying with every heartbeat. "I've got you, Vance," Nixara's voice cut through the roar of the steam. "Do not look at the pit. Look at me." Vance kept his eyes locked on her amber gaze. He tried to find the rhythm, but his heart was a frantic, irregular hammer. The bridge cracked. A spiderweb of fractures raced across the glass beneath him. "Vance!" Nixara lunged forward as far as the solid deck would allow, her hands straining to reach him. He froze halfway across. The violet light was fading, the glass becoming as thin as a soap bubble. He was going to fall. The math was simple. Weight plus instability equals 0. "Bug out, Nixara," Vance yelled, his voice cracking. "Get the kid to the maintenance tunnels. Leave me." "No," Nixara roared, her voice echoing off the bulkheads. "I am not the Warden. I do not leave my pack." She didn't just reach for him. She sang. It wasn't a lullaby this time. It was a Velnari war chant, a harsh, rhythmic vocalization that slammed into the ship's subsonics like a physical blow. The vibration traveled through the air, through the deck, and into the bridge. The violet light snapped back to sapphire. The fractures healed. Vance didn't think. He ran. He lunged across the final 3 meters of glass, his boots skidding on the cooling surface just as the bridge dissolved behind him into a mist of glowing particles. He slammed into Nixara, and they both tumbled back onto the solid deck, gasping for air. Silas's laughter crackled over the speakers, but it sounded thinner now, more annoyed. "A touching display, truly, but you've just crossed into the maintenance strata, Vance. The bridge was the easy part. Now you get to see what the Aethelgard is actually hiding in her basement." Vance stood up, his legs shaking, his heart finally slowing down to match the ship's hum. He looked at Nixara. She was still holding Kiri, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. "You didn't leave," Vance breathed. "I told you, human," Nixara said, her voice raspy but steady. "I am a shield bearer, and you are a terrible bridge walker. Try to keep up." They moved away from the chasm and toward a heavy circular hatch embossed with the sigil of the pre-rift engineers. As Vance placed his hand on the manual override, he felt a strange, new sensation. It wasn't just the ship's rhythm. He felt a faint, echoing pulse from the other side of the door. "We're not the only ones down here," Vance whispered. He yanked the lever. The hatch hissed open, revealing a world that looked less like a ship and more like a subterranean jungle. This was the maintenance strata, the biological guts of the Aethelgard. Giant, vein-like pipes pulsed with translucent fluid, and the walls were covered in thick, glowing moss that smelled of damp earth and static. And in the center of the room, surrounded by a dozen hovering security drones, were 2 figures. One was a scrawny human in an oversized prisoner's jumpsuit, his hair a frantic nest of curls, his eyes darting around with the intensity of a trapped bird. The other was a 4-armed, hairless creature with multifaceted eyes that shimmered like oil on water. They were backed against a pulsating coolant tank, the human brandishing a piece of bent metal pipe like a holy relic. "Stay back, you floating toasters," the human shrieked. "I've got a heavy-duty scrap iron, and I'm not afraid to use it. I'll turn your logic boards into confetti. I swear on my mother's gravity boot. Probability of successful combat with current weaponry, 0.003%. The 4-armed creature buzzed, its voice a melodic series of clicks and tones. Milo, your verbal aggression is statistically insignificant to their subroutines. Shut it, Aster. I'm doing the intimidating here. Nyxara lunged before Vance could say a word. She was a blur of obsidian shadows, her claws finding the central sensors of the lead drone before it could fire its stun baton. She twisted in midair, using the drone's own momentum to slam it into another. Vance didn't have a weapon, but he had a mechanic's eye. He spotted the drone's wireless charging hub on the ceiling. He grabbed a loose cable from a nearby wall panel, ripped the insulation off with his teeth, and jammed the live wires into the deck's grounding plate. "Get down!" Vance yelled. A massive arc of blue electricity surged across the floor. The drones, caught in the feedback loop, sparked and hissed, their stabilizers failing as they crashed to the deck in a pile of smoking scrap. The human, Milo, blinked, his pipe held mid-swing. He looked at the wreckage, then at Nyxara, who was currently standing over the lead drone with a fang-filled snarl, and finally at Vance. "Holy void," Milo breathed, his eyes wide. "You're the guy, the one who popped the locks in Sector 9. I heard the chatter on the comms before the drones shorted out. You're the crazy bastard who brought the cat warriors with him." "Vance Kestrel," Vance said, stepping forward and extending a hand. "And they're not cat warriors. They're my crew." Milo stared at Vance's hand, then took it with a grip that was surprisingly strong for such a jittery man. "Milo, professional scavenger, amateur orbital bombardier, and currently the most terrified man on this ship. This is Aster. He's an engineer from the Xylos territories. He's smart, but he has the personality of a dry-docked freighter." "Greeting acknowledged," Aster buzzed, his forearms moving in a complex pattern of salute. "Your utilization of the grounding plate was efficient. Sloppy, but efficient." "We're heading for the Song Core," Vance said, ignoring the critique. "Silas is driving this ship into the rift's center. If we don't take the wheel, we're all going to be crushed." Milo's face went pale. "The Song Core? That's suicide, mate. That's right in the middle of the Warden's private territory. He's got the elite guards up there, the biological ones with the white armor and the shock pikes. They don't miss like the drones do." "We don't have a choice," Nyxara said, her voice low and dangerous. "The ship is dying. Can you feel it?" Milo looked around at the pulsating walls, the flickering moss, and the dripping pipes. "I feel like I'm inside the stomach of a very sick whale, if that's what you mean." "The Aethelgard is being tortured," Vance said. "Every second we wait, the distortion gets worse. If we reach the core, we can stabilize the resonance and pull the ship out. But I need people who know the maintenance routes. Aster, can you get us a map that doesn't show up on Silas's sensors?" Aster's eyes whirled. "The internal schematics are encoded in the biological lattice. I can interface with the moss nodes, but it will require a direct neural link. The feedback could be unpleasant." "Do it," Vance said. "We're already neck-deep in the unpleasant." As Aster moved toward the wall, pressing his 4 hands into the glowing moss, Milo turned to Vance, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Look, Kestrel, I'm all for the save-the-world bit, really, but there's a rumor going around the lower decks. They say Silas isn't just a warden. They say he's looking for something specific, a person, someone he lost in the rift 40 years ago." Vance felt a chill crawl down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. 40 years? The warden doesn't look a day over 50. "Time is a suggestion in the rift, mate," Milo said, glancing nervously at Kiri, who was watching him with wide golden eyes. "People go in. They come out older, younger, or inside out. Silas has been here a long time. They say he's obsessed with the song because he thinks it can turn back the clock." Vance looked at Kiri. She had reached out and was gently touching the glowing moss, her small face illuminated by the emerald light. She looked so small, so fragile against the backdrop of a ship that was literally unraveling. He thought of the Orion's wake. He thought of the 5 friends he had watched die because he had been too afraid to bet on anything but the math. "I don't care what he's looking for," Vance said, his voice hardening into steel. "He's using this ship as a cage. And I'm a salvage engineer, Milo. I don't like cages. I like things that are free to move." Aster pulled his hands away from the moss, a series of rapid clicks escaping his vocal synthesizer. "The route is established. We must move through the thermal processing plant. The temperature will exceed 45 degrees Celsius. The security density is low, but the environmental hazard is high. Sounds like a Tuesday, Vance said. He looked at Nyxara. Ready? Nyxara nodded, her tail lashing once in anticipation. Let's go see what the guts have to offer. As they moved deeper into the maintenance strata, the walls began to change. The blue bioluminescence was replaced by an angry, pulsing red. The air grew thick with the smell of superheated coolant and the metallic tang of blood. The ship was no longer humming a lullaby. It was beginning to scream. The heat in the thermal processing plant was a physical weight, a humid, suffocating blanket that made every breath feel like inhaling steam. Vance could feel the sweat soaking through his flight suit, stinging the fresh scratches on his arms. Beside him, Nyxara was struggling. The Velnari, with their thick fur and high metabolic rates, were not built for this kind of environment. She was panting heavily, her obsidian coat matted with moisture, her movements losing their sharp, predatory edge. Drink this, Vance said, handing her the flask of water. Nyxara didn't argue. She took a long, desperate gulp and then poured the rest over her head, the water sizzling as it hit her hot skin. Kiri was tucked into a makeshift sling on Milo's back, the scrawny human surprisingly agile despite his constant complaining. 98 degrees, Milo wheezed, wiping his brow with a greasy sleeve. I've been in some hot spots in my time. Literally, I once spent 2 days inside a dormant volcano on Velanus Prime, hiding from a bounty hunter. This is ridiculous. We're being slow-cooked, Kestrel. We're going to be a well-done human Velnari stew by the time we hit the core. Energy levels in this sector are at 112% capacity. Aster buzzed, his multifaceted eyes glowing a dim green. The Warden is diverting all auxiliary power to the resonance amplifiers. He is overdriving the biological components. At this rate, the hydroponics bay will suffer total necrotic failure within 3 hours. He's killing the ship to save his own skin, Vance muttered. They reached a vast, vaulted chamber that looked like the interior of a ribcage. Massive curved struts of white bone alloy arched overhead, supporting thousands of crystalline rods that glowed with a sickly, flickering light. This was the Aethelgard's secondary processing hub, the place where the ship's biological data was filtered and stored. But it wasn't empty. In the center of the room, hundreds of prisoners were strapped into upright medical pods. They weren't in cages. They were part of the machine. Thick, translucent tubes were plugged into their spines and skulls, pulsing with a rhythmic golden light. Their eyes were rolled back, their mouths open in silent, synchronized gasps. Holy void, Milo whispered, his pipe clattering to the deck. That's half the population of Sector 12. They aren't prisoners. They're batteries. Vance felt a wave of nausea hit him. He had seen some dark things in the salvage business, mass grave ships, ghost colonies, but this was a different level of horror. Silas wasn't just using the Velnari for their resonance. He was using the collective neural energy of every living thing on the ship to anchor the Aethelgard against the Kronos rift. The neural tap, Aster buzzed, his voice sounding uncharacteristically somber. A forbidden technology from the pre-expansion era. It utilizes the grief and fear of sentient beings to generate a high-intensity psychic frequency. Fear is the most stable energy source in the universe. It does not decay. Nyxara stepped toward the nearest pod. Inside was a young human woman, no more than 20 years old. Her face was a mask of frozen terror, her fingers twitching against the glass of the pod. We have to let them out, Nyxara said, her voice a low, vibrating growl. She raised her claws, her eyes burning with a savage fury. Wait! Vance grabbed her arm. Nyxara, look at the connections. They're hardwired. If you just rip those tubes out, the feedback will fry their brains. The ship is using them as a grounding loop. You cut the loop, and the energy surge will kill everyone in this room. So we just leave them? Nyxara snarled, turning on him. We leave them to be drained until they are nothing but empty husks? Is this your math again, Vance? The lives of the many over the suffering of the few? Vance flinched as if she had struck him. The ghosts of the Orion's wake shrieked in his mind. He saw the faces of his friends again, their eyes wide with the same silent terror he saw in the pods. It's not math, Nyxara, Vance shouted. It's physics. If we do this wrong, we aren't saving them. We're executing them. I need time to find the bypass. I need to find the central node and shut it down from the inside. We do not have time. Silas's voice erupted from the room's speakers, but this time it wasn't a broadcast. It was a direct address. A holographic projector in the center of the ribcage flickered to life. High Warden Silas appeared, standing on a bridge of pure white light. He looked older than he had in the previous projections, his skin pale and translucent, his eyes glowing with the same sickly golden light as the tubes in the pods. "The chief engineer is right, Nixara," Silas said, his voice echoing with a haunting, dual tonality. "Interference will result in total system collapse. These batteries, as you call them, are the only reason we haven't been torn apart by the gravity shear. They are the price of survival." "You're a monster, Silas," Vance said, stepping into the center of the room. "You're using their pain to pilot a ship you don't even understand." "Oh, I understand it better than you could possibly imagine, Vance," Silas said, a sad, twisted smile touching his lips. "I understand that the universe is a machine that runs on loss. Every star that burns is a death cry of hydrogen. Every life that thrives is built on the ruins of another." He leaned forward, the hologram looming over them. "You think you're different because you feel guilty? Guilt is just a malfunction, Vance. It's a friction loss in your decision-making process. I've spent 40 years in this rift. I've seen 1,000 versions of you try to save everyone. And you know what happens in every single one of them? You fail. You watch them die, and then you become me." Vance felt the air leave his lungs. "What are you talking about?" "The Chronos Rift isn't just space, Vance," Silas whispered. "It's a closed loop. We are the same man, separated only by 40 years of failure and a very long, very loud song. I am what happens when the chief engineer finally realizes that the math is the only truth." "No," Vance breathed, shaking his head. "That's impossible. My ID code, my biometric signature." "Modified by the ship," Silas shrugged. "The Aethelgard needed a warden. It needed someone who understood its guts. I gave it what it wanted. In exchange, it gave me the hope that I could find the one frequency that would bring her back." He looked at Kiri, who was staring at the hologram with a look of profound alien recognition. "The child. She is the final component. Her resonance is pure. She hasn't been corrupted by the math yet. Give her to me, Vance. Let me use her to complete the song, and I will let the rest of you go. I will vent the rift and drop the ship into real space." "Never!" Nixara stepped in front of Vance, her body a wall of obsidian fury. "You're lying," Vance said, his voice regaining its steel. "If you were me, you'd know that I'd rather burn the whole ship down than give you that kid. You're not me, Silas. You're just the ghost of a choice I'm never going to make." Silas's expression shifted from sad to icy. "A pity. I was hoping to avoid the mess. But if you won't be a part of the harmony, then you are simply noise, and noise must be filtered." The hologram vanished. Immediately, the medical pods began to pulse with a blinding red light. The prisoners inside began to scream. Not a human sound, but a high-pitched electronic screech that tore through the air. The ship's gravity stabilizers failed, and the room began to tilt, the massive bone alloy struts groaning under the strain. "Vance!" Milo yelled, clinging to a support pillar. "The floor is turning into a wall, and those pods are starting to leak." The translucent tubes were rupturing, spilling glowing, golden fluid onto the deck. Where the fluid touched the metal, it hissed and corroded. The prisoners were being overloaded, their neural energy backwashing into the room. "Aster!" Vance shouted, sliding across the deck toward the central processing hub. "I need a localized EMP. We have to knock out the neural tap without killing the batteries." "Theoretical possibility, 11%, Aster buzzed, his arms blurring as he worked a panel. "It will require a massive power surge from the primary cooling line. I will have to bypass the safety limiters." "Do it!" Vance reached the central hub, a massive crystal rod that pulsed with the screams of the prisoners. He grabbed a heavy wrench from his belt and smashed the glass casing. A wave of psychic energy hit him, a hammer blow of pure, unadulterated grief. He saw the Orions wake again. He felt the cold of the vacuum. He heard the dying whispers of his friends. "Vance." Why did you leave us? It was the math, John. I'm sorry. The math was wrong, Vance. You were the only one who could have saved us. Shut up, Vance roared, his eyes bleeding, his mind fracturing. It's not real. It's just the ship. A hand slammed into his shoulder. Not a human hand. A paw with obsidian fur and retracted claws. Vance, look at me. Nyxara was standing over him, her forehead pressed against his. She was vibrating, her purr a deep, thunderous roar that acted as a physical barrier against the psychic noise. Anchor to me. I am the shield. I am the pack. Vance grabbed her arms, burying his face in her shoulder. Her heat, her scent of dust and static, her unshakable, predatory reality. It was the only thing that kept him from shattering. Now, Aster, Vance screamed. Aster jammed a makeshift conductive rod into the crystal core. A blinding flash of white light erupted, followed by a sound like a thunderclap inside a closed room. The psychic screaming stopped instantly. The red lights in the pods died. The golden fluid ceased its flow. For a heartbeat, there was total, absolute silence. Then the sound of the ship returned, but it was different. It was a low, wounded moan. The Aethelgard was no longer being tortured, but it was dying. Without the neural tap to anchor it, the ship was sliding into the gravity well of the Kronos rift. We did it, Milo wheezed, sitting up in a pile of scrap. We're not batteries anymore. We're just doomed. Vance pulled back from Nyxara. He looked at the medical pods. The prisoners were slumped over, unconscious but alive. Their breathing was shallow but steady. He had saved them. He hadn't done the math. He had done the impossible. Vance, Nyxara said, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. Look at the viewport. The maintenance strata had a small, reinforced window. Outside, the Kronos rift was no longer a swirling storm of violet energy. It had become a wall of pure, blinding white. The event horizon. We're at the edge, Vance whispered. The gravity shear is going to tear the hull plating off in 5 minutes. So we go to the core? Milo asked, his voice trembling. No, Vance said, looking at the unconscious prisoners. We can't leave them. We can't move 300 people to the core in 5 minutes. Then what? Nyxara asked. Vance looked at the central crystal hub he had just shattered. He looked at Kiri, who was standing in the center of the room, her small hands raised as if she were feeling the vibrations of the stars themselves. We don't go to the core, Vance said, a reckless, desperate plan forming in his mind. We bring the core to us. How? Aster buzzed. The song core is a localized biological entity. It cannot be moved. The ship is a seed vessel, Aster, Vance said, his fingers flying over the damaged terminal. It was built to grow. The song core is just the brain. The neural tap was the nervous system. I've still got a connection to the primary resonance loop. He looked at Nyxara. I need you to be the anchor again. But this time I need you to sing to the whole ship. I need you to tell the Aethelgard that the pack is here, that we aren't batteries. We're the crew. Nyxara looked at the hundreds of sleeping people, then at the wall of white fire outside. She nodded slowly. I will sing, Vance, but you have to hold the wires. I've got the wires, Vance said. As they prepared for the final resonance, Silas's voice came over the comms one last time. It didn't sound like a warden anymore. It sounded like a man who was watching his only hope vanish into the dark. You're going to kill them all, Vance, Silas whispered. Kindness is the ultimate error. You're going to burn the pack to save the ghosts. Watch us, Silas, Vance said, his hands glowing with the blue light of the ship. Watch us do the math your way. He jammed his hands into the exposed data conduits. The ship didn't just roar, it began to change. The bone alloy struts began to shift, the walls expanding, the moss glowing with a blinding, sapphire brilliance. The Aethelgard was no longer a cage. It was a cocoon, and in the center of the storm, Vance Kestrel felt the weight of 300 lives settle onto his shoulders. It was heavy. It was impossible. And for the first time in his life, he didn't try to subtract a single one of them. The ascent from the maintenance strata to the upper lattice was not a journey through space, but a climb through a fracturing reality. As the Aethelgard drifted deeper into the event horizon of the Kronos rift, the laws of physics began to fray like a tattered shroud. In some corridors, gravity felt as heavy as molten lead, pinning Vance's chin to his chest. In others, It vanished entirely, leaving them to kick and swim through air that tasted like static and ancient dust. "Keep your head on a swivel," Vance grunted, his voice strained by the shifting pressures. He was hauling himself up a service ladder that seemed to stretch for 3 kilometers, though the ship's internal schematics claimed it was only 50 meters. Behind him, Milo was panting, his face a pale shade of green that matched the glowing moss of the lower decks. "I'm trying, Kestrel, I really am," Milo wheezed, his fingers white-knuckled on the rungs. "But my head is currently doing 3,600 rotations per minute. I feel like my internal organs are trying to play musical chairs. Tell me again why we're going up toward the guy with the god complex instead of down toward the escape pods." "Because the pods are ghost-locked," Aster buzzed from the shadows above. The four-armed engineer was scuttling up the ladder with terrifying efficiency, his hands and feet moving in a synchronized blur. "The Warden has rerouted the launch protocols through the Song Core. Even if we reach the hangar, we would just be sitting in very expensive metal coffins, watching the rift turn us into subatomic soup." Nyxara was the anchor at the bottom, her eyes darting between the rungs and the darkness below. She carried Kiri strapped to her back in a harness made of reinforced cabling. The child was silent, her golden eyes reflecting the erratic flashes of violet light bleeding through the hull plates. "Quiet," Nyxara hissed, her ears swiveling toward the top of the shaft. "I hear movement, not drones, heavy footsteps, rhythmic, professional." Vance froze. He felt a vibration in the ladder, a sharp metallic resonance. "Silas's elite guard, the biologicals. They don't rely on the wireless hub, so my EMP trick won't work on them. They're prime-cut soldiers, armored in ceramic weave and high on combat stimulants." "Great," Milo muttered. "So we're fighting the varsity team now. Any chance they're open to a bribe? I have half a tube of nutrient paste and a very sentimental leather glove." "Stow the chatter, Milo," Vance said, reaching for the hatch at the top of the ladder. "Aster, give me a scan of the room beyond." Aster pressed his multifaceted eyes against the seal of the hatch. 3 life forms, high-intensity thermal signatures. They are positioned in a triangular kill zone. If we open this hatch, we will be neutralized within 2 seconds. Vance looked at Nyxara. She didn't look afraid. She looked hungry. The obsidian fur on her shoulders was bristling, and her claws were already extended, scraping softly against the metal. "I will go first," Nyxara said. It wasn't an offer. It was an ultimatum. "I am the shield. You are the mechanic. You cannot fix the ship if you have a shock pike through your chest." "Nyxara, wait," Vance said, grabbing her arm. "If you go out there alone, they'll swarm you. We need a distraction, something that messes with their sensors." He looked at the service panel beside the ladder. It was an auxiliary coolant line, pressurized and volatile. A reckless, dangerous idea began to form in his mind. It was the kind of plan that ignored the math of safety entirely. "Milo, give me that pipe," Vance commanded. Milo handed over the bent scrap metal. Vance used it to pry open the housing of the coolant line. A hiss of superheated gas escaped, stinging his skin. He began to reroute the flow, his fingers moving with a desperate, practiced grace. He wasn't calculating the risk of an explosion. He was calculating the necessity of his pack's survival. "On my mark, I'm going to vent the coolant into the room above," Vance whispered. "It'll create a whiteout. Nyxara, you go high. Aster, you go low. Milo, stay behind me and try not to get KIA. "Finally, a job I'm qualified for," Milo muttered. 3, 2, 1. Mark. Vance slammed the pipe into the valve. A roar of pressurized steam and liquid nitrogen erupted upward, the hatch blowing open from the force. The white clouds swallowed the room above. Nyxara didn't hesitate. She launched herself through the hatch like a shadow fired from a cannon. Aster followed, his forearms allowing him to scale the walls and ceiling simultaneously. Vance scrambled up the ladder, Milo right on his heels. They emerged into a wide, crystalline corridor that looked like it belonged in a cathedral rather than a starship. The air was freezing, filled with the swirling white mist of the coolant. Through the fog, Vance saw the combat. It was a blur of violence. The elite guards were massive, their white ceramic armor glowing with internal power cells. They wielded shock pikes that hissed with blue electricity, striking out at the shadows. But Nyxara was faster. She was a nightmare in the mist, appearing and disappearing, her claws leaving deep, jagged scores in the ceramic plates. Aster was a whirlwind of limbs, using his extra hands to grab the guard's pikes and redirect the energy into the deck. One guard swung a heavy gauntlet at Vance, but Milo, fueled by a sudden, frantic burst of courage, swung his metal pipe with a primal scream. The pipe shattered against the guard's helmet, but the impact was enough to buy Vance the second he needed. Vance dove for the guard's exposed neck joint, driving a heavy-duty soldering iron he'd pulled from his belt into the wiring. The guard convulsed, the internal power cell short-circuiting in a spray of sparks, and collapsed. The room went silent, save for the heavy breathing of the survivors and the hiss of the dying coolant. 3 elite guards lay incapacitated on the deck. Nyxara stood in the center of the room, her obsidian fur matted with white frost, a thin line of blue blood trickling from a cut on her cheek. She looked at Kiri, who was wide-eyed but unharmed in her harness. "Is everyone in one piece?" Vance asked, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "I think I broke my dignity," Milo wheezed, leaning against a crystalline pillar. "But otherwise, I'm still upright." "Aster?" "Structural integrity maintained," the four-armed engineer buzzed, though one of his secondary arms was hanging limp. "Minor circuit damage. It is acceptable." Vance looked at the far end of the corridor. There, framed by 2 massive pillars of pulsing data crystals, was a set of doors made of polished obsidian. They didn't lead to a bridge or a cockpit. They led to the heart of the song. "He's waiting," Nyxara said, her eyes fixed on the doors. Vance stepped forward, but as he reached the doors, they didn't slide open. They dissolved. The obsidian surface melted away like liquid, revealing a room that was a perfect, terrifying mirror of the song core they had seen in the lower decks. But this one was complete. The room was a vast, spherical void, lined with millions of crystalline rods that glowed with a soft, golden light. In the center, suspended in a web of glowing filaments, was a throne of glass. And sitting on that throne was High Warden Silas. He didn't look like a villain from a cheap space opera. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by time. His face was a map of 1,000 failures, his eyes filled with a weary ancient sadness. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't need one. The entire ship was his weapon. "You came," Silas said, his voice echoing through the chamber with a dual tonality that vibrated in Vance's teeth. "I watched you cross the bridge. I watched you save the batteries. I watched you choose the pack." He stood up, the glass filaments stretching and humming as he moved. He walked toward them, his steps echoing on a floor that didn't seem to be there. "Look at me, Vance," Silas whispered. Vance stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his wrench. He looked at Silas's face, the nose, the brow, the set of the jaw. It was like looking into a mirror that showed a version of himself that had spent 40 years in a lightless room. "You said we were the same man," Vance said, his voice hard. "Prove it." Silas raised his right arm. He rolled up the sleeve of his white uniform, revealing his forearm. There, etched into the skin, was a series of 5 small white scars. Vance's breath caught in his throat. He looked at his own left arm, where the scratches from Nyxara were still healing under the bandages. The shape, the spacing, the angle, they were identical. "The rift is a loop, Vance," Silas said, his voice filled with a terrible soft grief. 40 years ago, I stood where you are standing. I had my warrior, I had my child, I had my scrappy little crew, and I thought I was a hero. I thought kindness was enough to steer the Aethelgard." He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark stain. "But the rift doesn't care about kindness. It cares about weight. When we hit the center of the anomaly, the ship began to fracture. The resonance wasn't strong enough. I had to make a choice. I could save everyone and watch the ship be crushed, or I could consolidate the power." Silas looked at Nyxara, his expression one of agonizing regret. "I tried to hold the line. I really did. But the math was so clear. To save the ship, I had to let the resonance go. I had to let the pack be consumed by the storm so that the hull would hold. I was the only survivor. I spent 30 years drifting in the white fire, alone with the ghosts of the people I loved." "So you became the Warden," Nyxara spat, her eyes burning. "You became the monster who gassed us and turned us into batteries. You didn't save us, Silas. You murdered us 40 years before we were even born. I became what was necessary, Silas roared, his voice shaking the crystalline pillars. I spent 10 years finding a way to restart the loop. I built the neural tap. I gathered the Velnari. I did it all so I could reach this moment again. I'm not trying to kill you, Vance. I'm trying to give you the one thing I didn't have. A second chance. He pointed at Kiri. She is the key. Her resonance is the only thing that can stabilize the core long enough to exit the rift without losing the ship. If you give her to the machine, the rest of you will live. You can take the Talon. You can go home. You can break the cycle. Vance looked at Kiri. The child was staring at Silas with a look of profound, quiet pity. She reached out and touched Vance's hand, her fingers small and warm. The choice is yours, Vance, Silas whispered. Do you want to be a hero who watches his family die, or do you want to be the man who survives? Do you want to repeat my failure, or do you want to be the one who finally walks away? Vance felt the weight of the universe settling onto his shoulders. He looked at Nyxera, who was ready to die for him. He looked at Milo and Aster, who had followed him into the mouth of hell. He looked at the scars on his arm. He thought of the Orion's wake. He thought of the 5 friends he had left behind because he believed in the math of survival. You're right about one thing, Silas, Vance said, his voice low and steady. The math is clear, but you're using the wrong equation. Silas's eyes narrowed. What? You think family is something you can trade to save the ship, Vance said, stepping toward the throne. You think survival is the goal. But I've lived that life, Silas. I've lived with the remainder of your math for 7 years. And it's not living. It's just waiting to die. He looked Silas in the eye, his gaze unwavering. Family isn't a variable you subtract to find a solution. Family is the solution. If the ship can't hold us all, then the ship doesn't deserve to fly. I'm not giving you the kid, and I'm not letting you kill the pack. Silas's face twisted into a mask of cold, clinical rage. Then you have chosen death. And I will watch you burn, just like I watched them burn 40 years ago. The crystalline rods in the room began to glow with a blinding, violent violet. The song core erupted into a maelstrom of discordant sound. The siege of hearts had begun. The atmosphere in the song core didn't just vibrate, it shattered. The golden light of the crystals was swallowed by a tidal wave of violet energy. The raw, unfiltered radiation of the Chronos rift bleeding through the ship's primary seals. Silas retreated toward the glass throne, his form shimmering as he merged with the ship's interface. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a ghost in the machine. His consciousness spread across 1 billion kilometers of biological circuitry. The ship is mine, Vance, Silas's voice boomed from every direction at once, a thunderous roar that sent Milo to his knees. I am the Aethelgard. I am the song. You are nothing but a splinter in the hull. A massive shock wave of kinetic energy swept through the chamber. Vance was thrown backward, sliding across the translucent floor. Nyxera planted her feet, her claws digging into the glass as she shielded Kiri with her own body. Aster was a flurry of activity, his forearms tapping into a nearby auxiliary terminal, trying to find a gap in Silas's firewalls. Silas has established a total neural override, Aster buzzed, his voice distorted by the interference. He is utilizing 60% of the ship's processing power to maintain the internal gravity wells. We are being crushed from within. Vance struggled to stand, the weight of the air feeling like a mountain. He looked at the glass throne. Silas was sitting there, his eyes closed, his hands glowing with the same violet fire as the rift. Every time Vance's heart beat, the room shifted, the floor tilting at a 50-degree angle. Milo, Vance shouted, his voice hoarse. The coolant pipes, the ones we vented in the hallway. Are they still connected to the primary heat exchange? Milo looked up, his face slick with sweat. Yeah, why? Are we planning on giving the Warden a cold shower? Because I think he's beyond the point of a spa day, Kestrel. If we can bridge the coolant flow into the song core's primary capacitors, we can create a thermal variance, Vance explained, his mind racing through 1,000 mechanical schematics. It won't stop Silas, but it'll create enough noise in the system to break his concentration. I need a distraction. Distraction is my middle name, Milo grunted, standing up and grabbing his metal pipe. Actually, it's Percival, but I like distraction better. Aster, help me with the valve couplings. The two of them scrambled toward the edge of the chamber, where the massive crystalline rods met the floor. Nyxara turned to Vance, her obsidian fur bristling. "What about us?" she asked. "We have to reach the throne," Vance said, pointing to the web of filaments. "I need to plug into the core directly. If I can achieve a higher resonance than Silas, I can override his commands." "He will burn you, Vance," Nyxara said, her hand gripping his shoulder. "A total neural sync without a dampener. Your mind will be stripped of its identity. You will become the song." "Then I won't do it alone," Vance said. He looked at Kiri. The child was standing between them, her golden eyes fixed on the violet storm above. She wasn't shaking anymore. She reached out and took Vance's hand with her left and Nyxara's with her right. "The song is lonely," Kiri whispered. It was the longest sentence she had spoken, her voice clear and melodic, cutting through the roar of the ship. "It wants to go home. It's tired of being angry." Vance felt a jolt of electricity travel from the child's hand into his arm. It wasn't the painful shock of a drone's baton. It was a warm, pulsing current that tasted like sunlight and smelled like rain. "You heard her," Vance said to Nyxara. "The ship isn't Silas's weapon. It's a survivor, just like us. It's just scared." "Then let's give it something to be brave about," Nyxara said, a savage, beautiful grin touching her lips. They began their charge toward the throne. Silas noticed them immediately. The violet energy in the air coalesced into a dozen jagged shards of light, which hurtled toward them like crystalline spears. "Defend the anchor!" Nyxara roared. She was a whirlwind of obsidian fury, her claws parrying the energy spears with a speed that defied human vision. She moved in a series of jagged, unpredictable leaps, drawing Silas's fire away from Vance and Kiri. Every time a spear struck her, a spray of blue blood hit the deck. But she didn't slow down. She was the shield bearer, and she was fulfilling a duty 40 years in the making. Vance focused on the throne. Every step was a battle. The air was becoming thick, a psychic pressure that tried to force him to his knees. He saw the ghosts again, the crew of the Orion's wake. They were standing in the shadows, their eyes hollow, their hands reaching for him. "Vance, join us. The math is so easy in the dark. Just let go." "No!" Vance screamed, his voice echoing in the void. "I'm not leaving anyone. Not this time." He felt Kiri's hand squeeze his. The ghost flickered and faded, replaced by the reality of the child's warmth. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the chamber. "Coolant vented!" Milo's voice shrieked over the comms. "Get ready for the frostbite, boys and girls!" A cloud of superheated steam and liquid nitrogen erupted from the base of the crystalline rods. The thermal variance hit the core like a physical blow. The violet light flickered, turning a muddy gray as the capacitors struggled to compensate for the sudden drop in temperature. Silas screamed, a sound that was half human, half electronic. He arched his back on the throne, the filaments glowing with a blinding, erratic white light. The gravity wells in the room collapsed, throwing everyone toward the center of the sphere. "Now, Vance!" Aster buzzed, his forearms braced against a coolant tank. "The resonance loop is open. 0.04 seconds until the security dampeners reset." Vance didn't hesitate. He launched himself toward the central filament web, Kiri still gripped in his hand. They hit the glowing wires together. The world vanished. Vance wasn't on the Aethelgard anymore. He was floating in a vast, infinite ocean of light. It was the song. He felt the thoughts of every living thing on the ship, the fear of the prisoners, the determination of Garen, the jittery bravery of Milo, the clinical logic of Aster. And then he felt Silas. The Warden's mind was a black, jagged void in the center of the light. It was a place of absolute cold and infinite grief. Vance saw the moment Silas had made the choice. He saw the warrior and the child 40 years ago, their faces identical to Nyxara and Kiri. He saw Silas cut the power. He heard the screams. It was the only way. Silas's voice echoed in the psychic space. 1 life for 1,000. The math was right. The math was a lie, Silas, Vance countered, his voice booming through the ocean of light. You didn't do it to save the 1,000. You did it because you were afraid to be the one who died. You chose your own survival and called it sacrifice. Vance reached out, but he didn't use a wrench or a soldering iron. He used the resonance. He pulled on the connections he had built over the last 5 days. He felt Nyxara's strength. He felt Kiri's innocence. He felt Milo's stubbornness. He didn't try to push Silas out. He tried to pull everyone else in. "Aethelgard!" Vance shouted, his soul vibrating with the ship's primary frequency. "Listen to the pack. We are not your batteries. We are your crew. We choose to be here. We choose to hold the line." The black void of Silas's mind began to shrink. The sapphire light of the ship returned, warmer and brighter than before. The discordant noise of the song settled into a harmonious, rhythmic pulse. Thump, 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 thump. The ship began to sing. Back in the physical chamber, Silas was being ejected from the throne. The filaments were snapping, the violet energy retreating toward the edges of the room. Silas fell to the deck, his white uniform charred, his skin looking like ancient parchment. Vance and Kiri dropped from the web, Nyxara catching them before they hit the floor. Vance was gasping, blood trickling from his ears and eyes, but his gaze was clear. He walked over to Silas. The warden was lying in a heap, his good eyes staring up at the ceiling. He looked small. He looked like a man who had finally run out of time. You didn't do the math," Silas whispered, his voice a mere shadow of a sound. "No," Vance said, kneeling beside him. "I did the humanity. You should try it sometime, Silas. It's a lot more efficient." Silas let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at Kiri, who was standing over him, her hand raised. She placed her fingers on his forehead. "Go to sleep, lonely man," Kiri said softly. "The song will take you home." Silas's eye closed. The tension left his body. The man who had been the warden for 40 years simply ceased to be, his consciousness dissolving into the ship he had tried so hard to control. The Aethelgard lurched. "Status report," Vance shouted, standing up and leaning on Nyxara. "Kronos Rift is collapsing." Aster buzzed, his hands flying over a now functional terminal. "The resonance has stabilized the hull, but the gravity shear is pulling us toward the exit point. We have 2 minutes until we hit real space." "Is the ship going to hold?" Milo asked, his voice trembling with hope. "The ship is holding us, Milo," Vance said, looking around at the glowing sapphire pillars. "It's doing the heavy lifting now." The Aethelgard didn't just exit the rift, it tore through it. There was a moment of blinding white light, a sensation of infinite speed, and then darkness. But it was a good darkness. It was the darkness of open space, filled with a billion steady, non-flickering stars. The alarm klaxons fell silent. The red lights were replaced by a soft, warm amber. The air smelled of fresh rain and the damp earth of the hydroponics bay. Vance slumped against the glass throne, his energy spent. He felt a small, warm weight settle against his side. Kiri. He felt a heavy, furred arm drape across his shoulders. Nyxara. "We made it," Milo breathed, staring out the viewport at the distant, beautiful curve of a planet. "We actually made it. I am going to find a sandwich, a very large, non-recycled sandwich, and then I'm going to sleep for 100 years. The Talon is hailing us," Aster said, his forearms operating the comms. "Matriarch Selene is demanding to know why the ship is humming a 3-note melody." Vance smiled, a tired, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Tell her it's a private performance, and tell her we're not looking for a rescue anymore. We're looking for a port." He looked at Nyxara. She was watching him, her amber eyes filled with a mixture of respect and something that looked a lot like love. "So, Chief Engineer," Nyxara said, her voice a low, rhythmic purr, "what is the math of our current situation?" Vance looked at his pack. The warrior, the child, the scavenger, the engineer. He thought of the 300 people sleeping in the pods below, who would wake up to a world where they weren't batteries. "The math is simple, Nyxara," Vance said, closing his eyes. 1 + 1 + 1 + 1 equals home." The silence that followed the exit from the Kronos Rift was not the hollow, terrifying void Vance Kestrel had feared for 7 long years. It was a dense, living quiet, a silence filled with the rhythmic breathing of 300 souls slowly waking from a nightmare. The sapphire light of the Aethelgard did not flicker or strobe. It glowed with a steady, warm luminescence, as if the ship itself were finally exhaling after holding its breath for 4 decades. Vance sat on the deck of the Song Corps, his back against the base of the glass throne. His hands were raw, the skin of his palms scorched by the neural feedback of the final resonance. But he didn't feel the pain. He felt the weight of Kiri's head on his lap and the heat of Nixara's shoulder pressed against his own. They were a tangle of dirt, blue blood, and exhaustion, yet they were anchored. "Status," Vance rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We are drifting at approximately 4 kilometers per hour relative to the Talon's position." Astor's voice buzzed over the localized comms. The engineer sounded weary, his usual clinical tone replaced by a strange, melodic vibration. "The structural integrity fields are at 98%. The Kronos rift has collapsed behind us. We are in the Helios sector, 3 light years from the nearest independent trading post. We are safe, Vance." "Safe," Milo's voice echoed, followed by a jagged, hysterical laugh. "I think I need to look that word up in the dictionary. Does safe usually include your bones feeling like they were put through a laundry press? Because I'm currently feeling very safe and very much like a wet noodle." Vance managed a small, tired smile. "You did good, Milo. You and Astor. If you hadn't vented that coolant, Silas would have fried my brain before I could find the frequency." "Yeah, well, don't make a habit of it," Milo grunted. "I'm a scavenger, Kestrel. I prefer my adrenaline in small, manageable doses, like finding a forgotten crate of vintage synthetic whiskey. This whole saving the galaxy gig is terrible for my complexion." Nixara shifted beside Vance, her amber eyes opening slowly. She looked at the dead man lying a few meters away, the man who was the ghost of Vance's future. Silas's body was small, almost fragile in the light of the stars. The white uniform was no longer a symbol of authority, but a shroud for a man who had forgotten how to be human. "He thought he was saving us," Nixara said softly, her ears swiveling toward the silence of the ship. "He thought the only way to keep the song going was to turn it into a cage. He lived 40 years in the dark, Vance. Can you imagine that? To be the only one who remembers the faces of the dead?" Vance looked at the scars on his arm, then at the peaceful face of Kiri. "I don't have to imagine it, Nixara. I lived it for 7 years. I was just as much a warden as he was. I walked through the world with my heart locked in a lead box, doing the math, making sure I never owed anyone anything. I was just as lonely as Silas. I just had a smaller ship." From the corridors below, a new sound began to rise. It wasn't the scream of alarms or the hiss of gas. It was the sound of voices. The 300 prisoners from the maintenance strata were waking up. They were confused, terrified, and weak, but they were alive. Garen's voice crackled over the ship-wide intercom. The big man sounded like he had been chewing on gravel, but there was a tremor of awe in his words. "Mechanic, you there? The pods. They just popped open. People are walking around. They're hungry, they're thirsty, and they're asking who the hell turned the sun back on. What do I tell them?" Vance looked at Nixara. She nodded once, the obsidian fur on her neck smoothing down. "Tell them the Aethelgard has a new crew," Vance said into his comlink. "Tell them to head to the hydroponics bay. We've got food, we've got water, and for the first time in a long time, we've got room to breathe. And Garen, tell them nobody is a battery anymore. We work the ship together, or we don't work it at all." The Talon, Matriarch Selene's sleek Velnari cruiser, loomed outside the viewports. Its black hull reflected the light of the distant sun, looking like a shard of midnight against the stars. A boarding party was already being prepared. Vance knew what was coming. Selene was a strategist, a leader who saw the universe in terms of assets and liabilities. To her, the Aethelgard was a windfall, a pre-rift seed vessel filled with technology and potential warriors. "She's going to try to take it," Nixara whispered, her claws extending just a fraction. "She will take the Velnari and leave the humans. She will say it is for the preservation of the species. She will do the math, Vance." "Then we'll have to show her that the math has changed," Vance said, standing up on shaky legs. He reached down and offered a hand to Nixara. She took it, her grip firm and warm. They met Matriarch Selene in the hangar bay. The air was still thick with the smell of scorched metal and ozone. Selene stepped off her shuttle, flanked by 10 warriors in full void armor. She looked at the wreckage of the Aethelgard, then at Vance and Nixara. Her gaze lingered on Kiri, who was standing between them, holding Vance's hand. "The ship is stable," Selene said, her voice a cool, professional blade. My engineers have scanned the hull. The resonance you achieved, it shouldn't have been possible with such a disorganized group. You have done a great service to the Velnari people, Vance Kestrel. I didn't do it for the Velnari people, matriarch, Vance said, his voice steady. I did it for my crew. Celine's eyes narrowed. Your crew? You mean these refugees and scavengers? Vance, be reasonable. The Talon has the facilities to care for the Velnari survivors. We can offer them a future on the new territories. As for the humans, we can drop them at the nearest independent station with enough credits to start over. It is the most efficient path. Efficient, Vance repeated the word like a bitter taste. 40 years ago, a man told me that efficiency was the only truth. He told me that survival was a zero-sum game. He spent 40 years being efficient, and he ended up a ghost in a haunted house. Vance stepped forward, gesturing to the hundreds of people now gathering in the hangar. Humans, Velnari, insectoids, and species Vance didn't even have a name for. They were standing together, sharing blankets, helping the wounded, and talking in hushed, hopeful tones. Look at them, Celine, Vance said. They didn't survive because of their species. They survived because they chose to hold the line together. If you take the Velnari, you're not saving them. You're breaking the one thing that actually keeps this ship flying. Isfamarno. You're suggesting I leave 300 civilians on a damaged seed vessel in the middle of a war zone? Celine challenged. That is a death sentence. No, Nyxara said, stepping up to Vance's side. It is a beginning. The Aethelgard isn't just a ship. It is a home. We have fixed the engines. We have stabilized the song. We don't need your rescue, matriarch. We need your recognition. Celine looked at Nyxara, the shield-bearer she had once commanded. She saw the scar on Nyxara's side, the way she stood with the human, and the way the child looked at them both. Celine was a woman of logic, but even she couldn't deny the vibration in the air, the resonance that still hummed through the deck plates. The song core, Celine whispered, looking at the ceiling. It sounds different. It's not a solo anymore, Vance said. It's an ensemble. Celine was silent for a long time. She looked at her warriors, then at the mismatched family standing before her. Finally, she let out a short, sharp breath, a Velnari sign of grudging respect. The Talon will remain in the sector for 72 hours, Celine announced. We will provide medical supplies and technical assistance for the repairs. After that, you are on your own. The Aethelgard will be registered as an independent colony ship under the protection of the Velnari Covenant. But if you fail, Vance Kestrel, I will not come back to pick up the pieces. We won't fail, Vance said. We've already survived the worst version of ourselves. The rest is just maintenance. As the matriarch returned to her shuttle, Milo sidled up to Vance, his hands in his pockets. So, an independent colony ship, eh? Does that mean I'm officially a citizen? Do I get a title? I was thinking Lord Scavenger of the left-wing maintenance shaft. You get a wrench and a duty roster, Lord Scavenger, Vance said, clapping Milo on the back. We've got 10 decks of biological wiring to scrub and 1,000 light years of empty space to cross. Work, 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 Milo sighed, though he didn't look particularly upset. Aster, come on, 4 arms. We've got a ship to fix before the matriarch decides to change her mind and charges for the oxygen. Vance watched them walk away, the scrawny human and the 4-armed engineer bickering about efficiency and probability. He felt a small, furred hand slip into his. Kiri looked up at him, her golden eyes bright with the reflected light of the sun. Lou? Dare, she whispered. Yeah, Kiri, Vance said, picking her up and resting her on his hip. A little louder every day. He looked at Nyxara. She was staring out the hangar bay at the stars, her obsidian fur shimmering. She wasn't a feral beast, and she wasn't just a warrior. She was the anchor. I think I finally understand the math, Nyxara, Vance said. Oh? She tilted her head. And what is the sum? The sum of our lives isn't the years we spend surviving, Vance said, looking at the busy hangar bay. It's the people we choose to keep with us when the storm hits. Everything else is just noise. Nyxara purred, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the deck. Welcome home, Vance Kestrel. 3 months had passed since the Aethelgard had emerged from the Kronos Rift, and the ship was no longer a ghost. It had become a vibrant, breathing ecosystem. The hydroponics bay was a lush, emerald jungle that provided food for the 312 inhabitants. The maintenance strata had been scrubbed of the warden's filth, the medical pods repurposed into sleeping bunks that were surprisingly comfortable once you added enough recycled foam. Vance stood on the upper observation deck, looking out at the nebula they were currently navigating. The gas clouds were a brilliant tapestry of pink and gold, swirling like ink in water. In his hand he held a small silver locket, the only thing he had kept from Silas's belongings. Inside was a faded digital image of a woman Vance didn't recognize, but whose face felt like a memory he hadn't had yet. He didn't feel the old hollow ache in his chest anymore. The math of his life had been rewritten. "The star melons are ripening," a voice said behind him. Nyxara stepped onto the deck, her movements silent as always. She was wearing a modified engineering vest over her dark fur, a data pad tucked into one of the pockets. She looked healthy, her side wound nothing but a faint silver line beneath her coat. "Milo's already trying to ferment them into some kind of rocket fuel," Vance said, turning to her. "Aster says there's a 64% chance it'll blow up the kitchen, but he's helping him anyway, because he wants to see the chemical reaction." Nyxara chuckled, a warm, rhythmic sound. "And Kiri?" "She's in the song corps," Vance said, his voice softening. "She's teaching the new arrivals how to harmonize with the ship. We've got 20 people in the resonance loop now. The Aethelgard hasn't felt this steady since, well, probably since it was launched." Nyxara leaned against the railing, her eyes on the nebula. "There is a freighter approaching from the Helios station. They want to trade spare parts for some of our medicinal moss. Garen is handling the negotiations." Vance nodded. He wasn't the captain. They didn't have one. They had a council, a collection of survivors who made decisions based on the needs of the pack. Vance was just the chief engineer, the man who kept the lights on and the song playing. He looked down at his hands. They were covered in grease and old scars, but they were steady. He had spent the last 3 months working 12-hour shifts, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He had fixed the atmospheric scrubbers, repaired the gravity anchors, and built a playground for Kiri and the other children in the cargo bay. He wasn't running anymore. He was building. Vance walked to the center of the observation deck, where a small, unassuming terminal was located. This was the ship's primary archive, the place where the history of the Aethelgard was stored. He placed his hand on the interface. "Archive access, Kestrel Vance," he said. The terminal chirped. "Access granted. Welcome, Chief Engineer." Vance didn't look at the technical manuals or the navigation charts. He opened a new file, one he had been working on for weeks. It was a list. Not a list of supplies or fuel reserves, but a list of names. Every person on the ship was there. Their stories, their skills, their favorite foods, their fears. He began to type, adding the latest entry for a newborn Velnari kit, the first life to begin on the Aethelgard in 40 years. As he worked, Vance felt a profound sense of clarity. He looked back on the man he had been, the scavenger who lived in a one-man ship, the engineer who chose the math of the Orion's wake over the lives of his friends. He saw that man as a stranger now, a ghost from a timeline he had finally managed to break. "I spent 15 years in the salvage business, thinking that the universe was made of scrap metal and hard numbers. I believed that every choice had a cost, and that survival was the only currency that mattered. When I left the Orion's wake, I told myself I was being rational. I told myself that 5 lives were a fair trade for 30, but I was wrong. The cost wasn't 5 lives, it was my soul. I spent the next 7 years trying to outrun the math, only to find it waiting for me in the dark of the Kronos Rift. Looking at Silas, I saw what happens when you let fear take the wheel. He tried to build a family out of force and chemicals, but you can't manufacture a bond. It has to be grown in the dirt, through the sweat and the blood of choosing to stay when it's easier to run. I used to think family was something you were born into, a debt of blood you had no choice but to pay. Now I look at Nyxara, Kiri, Milo, and 300 strangers who would have been ghosts, and I realize that family is the most intentional thing in the world. It's the choice to be the bridge for someone else, even when you're not sure the glass will hold. I am still a mechanic, and I am still broken in places, but for the first time the pieces fit together. I'm not just fixing a ship anymore, I'm helping a home grow. And that is a math I can finally live with. Vance closed the archive and looked at Nixara. She was watching him, a quiet understanding in her amber eyes. She reached out and touched the scars on his arm, her fingers gentle. "You're not thinking about the math again, are you?" she asked. "No," Vance said, taking her hand. "I'm thinking about the future. I'm thinking about where we're going next." "Where are we going, Vance?" Vance looked out at the infinite expanse of the stars. He saw 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 new stories waiting to be written. "Everywhere," he said. He turned toward the door, his steps confident and light. He didn't need to look back at the throne or the scars. He was the chief engineer of the Aethelgard, and he had a pack to look after. As he walked down the corridor, he heard the song. It wasn't a scream or a cry for help. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse, the sound of 300 hearts beating in time with the ship. Thump, 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 thump. Vance hummed along, a simple three-note melody that had become the unofficial anthem of the ship. He passed the hydroponics bay, where the scent of star melons was thick and sweet. He passed the med bay, where Kiri was laughing as she played a game of tag with a group of human children. He was happy, not the loud, frantic happiness of a win, but the quiet, enduring happiness of a man who had finally found his anchor. Vance stopped at the end of the hall, looking at the stars through a small porthole. He thought about the people listening to his story, the ones drifting in their own versions of the void. "I spent years carrying that guilt like armor, only to realize it was a prison. I wonder, is there a math in your own life that you've been using to keep people at a distance? What would happen if you stopped calculating the cost of trust and just chose to belong?" Vance Kestrel turned away from the window and headed toward the song corps, his hand resting on the pulsing blue wall. He didn't look back. He was too busy moving forward, one heartbeat at a time.